2 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, in late 1858, a chilling silence settled over the pitch-black ocean floor. A thin strand of copper and iron wire, stretched across thousands of miles of crushing darkness, suddenly went completely cold and dead. For just 21 brief days, electrical pulses had flickered through the abyss, carrying human thought across the sea. Then, without warning, the weak signals dissolved into complete nothingness, leaving behind an eerie silence in the frozen mud. In that endless underwater void, where sunlight never penetrates and water pressure can shatter iron, the silent cable lay motionless. The brief connection between two continents vanished as if it had never existed, swallowed by the cold depths. Vast distances immediately reclaimed their absolute power over human affairs, plunging the world back into darkness and silence. The reckless dream that led to this catastrophic silence began with a man named Cyrus Field. He was a wealthy paper merchant from New York who knew almost nothing about electricity, engineering, or the ocean floor. Yet he became utterly possessed by an impossible idea: sinking a continuous telegraph cable across 2,000 miles of uncharted ocean floor to connect America and Europe. Field poured his own massive fortune into the project, and threw his entire reputation into convincing powerful governments and hesitant bankers to back his plan. He persuaded investors that human determination and copper wire could master the wild sea, raising massive amounts of capital to fund an enterprise that many prominent scientists considered total madness. Field's obsessive crusade pushed the project forward, but it created an enormous trap of impossible public expectations and overwhelming financial liability. Millions of dollars and the pride of two global empires now rested entirely on a single thread laid through unknown waters, setting off an extraordinarily dangerous venture where any small mistake meant instant ruin. To understand the desperate urgency behind Field's gamble, one must step into the dark reality of world isolation during the 1850s. In those quiet years, the ocean was an unbridgeable canyon that trapped human voices on separate shores. A single letter sent from London to New York had to travel by steamship, taking weeks to navigate stormy, ice-filled seas. Families waited through agonizing months of silence to learn if loved ones had survived perilous journeys or terrible illnesses. Governments made critical decisions based on news that was already weeks old, unable to prevent wars or economic panics sparked by delayed information. Trade moved at the slow, frustrating pace of ocean winds, leaving humanity constantly isolated by the vast sea. While society had grown accustomed to this painful separation, a small group of ambitious men decided to shatter the geographical boundary forever. They set out to build a physical bridge of copper directly through the deep abyss, setting the stage for one of the most perilous engineering disasters in human history. When Cyrus Field began assembling his team in 1854, his overwhelming confidence was built on almost complete ignorance. Scientists at the time knew as little about the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean as they did about the surface of the moon. Maps of the ocean floor were primitive guesses made by dropping heavy lead weights on long ropes into the swirling currents. Renowned naval experts and veteran sea captains issued stern warnings, arguing that the dark depths held unimaginable dangers. They warned that freezing temperatures and immense water pressure 2 miles down would instantly crush any insulation, snapping fragile wires like thread. But Field refused to listen, driven forward by an unyielding vision that ignored every physical reality. To anchor this wild dream, engineers chose 2 desolate, storm-swept outposts at the very edges of the known world. On the eastern side stood Valentia Island, a lonely, rock-strewn outcrop off the dark and rainy coast of Western Ireland. On the western side lay Trinity Bay in Newfoundland, a fog-choked wilderness dominated by jagged cliffs and icy waters. At these bleak coastal edges, weary crews labored in freezing sea spray and driving wind, hauling thick metal cables up rocky beaches. Cold salt water lashed at workers as they secured the heavy iron lines into wet earth, attempting to tame an unforgiving wilderness that seemed to actively resist human intrusion. These remote, wind-battered shorelines were designated as the essential shore stations, meant to unite two distant halves of human civilization. Engineers planned to send electrical signals back and forth between these lonely outposts, trusting that a fragile wire could endure the brutal forces of the open ocean between them. The actual cable manufactured for this massive attempt was a terrifying mechanical nightmare. Inside its core sat 7 thin strands of pure copper, meant to carry the delicate electrical current. This vulnerable core was wrapped in layers of gutta percha, a natural sap collected from tropical trees in Malaysia, and then surrounded by heavy coils of iron wire armor. Despite its thick outer armor, the multi-million-dollar cable remained tragically fragile and easily ruined. A sudden jerk of a ship deck in heavy swells could snap the copper inside like dry glass, while salt water could seep into tiny cracks in the sap coating, killing the signal instantly. Because late 19th century factories lacked precision testing machinery, thousands of miles of this complex line were produced with hidden structural defects. Workers coiled the heavy wire into ship holds without realizing that tiny fractures and weak spots were already lurking inside the insulation, waiting to fail under the deep ocean. To carry this unprecedented weight across the Atlantic, the British and American governments provided 2 of their largest military steamships. The HMS Agamemnon, a massive British warship, and the USS Niagara, a powerful American frigate, were stripped of their heavy guns and transformed into cable-laying vessels. Inside the dark holds of these modified war machines, workers stacked hundreds of tons of iron cable in endless heavy coils. As the ships prepared to sail out into the unpredictable North Atlantic weather, crew members looked down at the massive, snake-like coils with growing dread, fully aware that their ships were overloaded and dangerously unbalanced for the storm-filled sea ahead. In August 1857, off the bleak coast of Valentia Island, the immense undertaking faced its first catastrophic blow. The iron cable was paying out continuously from the stern of the warship, sliding into the dark sea at a steady 4 knots, while mechanics monitored every turn of the heavy iron winches. Suddenly, as the ocean floor dipped violently beneath the hull, the tension gauge spiked beyond its critical threshold, and an operator slammed down the mechanical brake to slow the unraveling spool. The cast-iron jaws locked around the line with fatal force, stopping the spool instantly while the ship pulled forward against the immovable mass. The immense strain snapped the iron-armored wire in a fraction of a second, hurling severed strands back onto the deck with the force of a whip. Thousands of feet of copper wire, encased in layers of natural rubber, spiraled backward into the black depths of the Atlantic abyss, completely beyond recovery. On the deck of the ship, sailors and engineers stood in absolute silence as the dead end sank forever into 3,000 feet of water, taking 300 miles of wire and a fortune in capital with it. That single mechanical failure at sea instantly crippled the expedition, forcing the ships to retreat to port with empty holds and shattered confidence. The loss of hundreds of miles of cable meant the entire project had to be abandoned for the remainder of the year, leaving the vast ocean as silent and unconquered as before. During the punishing winter of 1857 and 1858, Cyrus Field returned to shore to confront an escalating catastrophe of public perception and financial ruin. Investors who had poured their fortunes into the venture accused the directors of reckless speculation and deception, while newspapers mocked the attempt as a foolish war against nature itself. Field moved tirelessly between boardrooms in London and New York, begging for fresh funds while selling off personal assets to keep his company from collapsing into bankruptcy. To raise fresh capital, Field had to re-engineer the entire mechanical apparatus from the ground up, ordering new automatic brakes designed to release tension instantly whenever the strain became lethal. He gathered more copper and iron, forcing manufacturers to work around the clock to produce hundreds of additional miles of telegraph wire under strict quality controls. Engineers spent cold spring months testing the revised braking mechanisms on land, running miles of experimental wire through weighted pulleys to measure exact braking points under high stress. Every splice was inspected with early electrical meters to ensure continuous conductivity before the massive spools were lowered back into the warships. When the fleet set sail again in June 1858, nature struck back with terrifying violence in the open Atlantic. A massive 10-day tempest battered the modified warship Agamemnon, tossing the heavily burdened vessel into gargantuan troughs of ocean water that threatened to roll her completely over. Inside the hold, the coal bunkers collapsed, sending loose coal and heavy machinery smashing into the vast coils of underwater cable, threatening to shred the fragile insulation before a single mile was laid. Drenched crew members worked in total darkness below deck, trapped in a suffocating chamber of sliding coal and iron, while the ship groaned under relentless waves. Terrified sailors fought to keep the heavy coils from unraveling and destroying the hull, knowing that if the ship foundered, everyone on board would sink into the cold depths along with their dream. Although the storm finally subsided and left the fleet battered but afloat, the brutal rolling of the ship had severely kinked and weakened the cable in dozens of hidden places. The delicate copper strands beneath the outer armor had been bent back and forth repeatedly, leaving microfractures in the insulation that would invite salt water to destroy the signal. Refusing to give up, the commanders decided to attempt a radical strategy, sailing both major warships to the exact midpoint of the Atlantic Ocean. There, in the middle of a vast watery wilderness 2 miles deep, engineers spliced the heavy cable ends from both vessels together using solder and gutta-percha compound, then lowered the giant knot into the abyss. The two ships then turned their sterns to one another and began sailing in opposite directions, one heading east toward Ireland and the other west toward Newfoundland, unspooling the joint wire into the dark depths between them. It was a desperate race against time and nature, attempting to bridge 2 continents from a single invisible point in the center of the sea. The mid-ocean splicing system required both ships to maintain identical speeds and precise electrical communication through the very wire they were dropping into the sea. Galvanometers on board monitored a continuous electrical pulse sent back and forth between the two vessels, letting each crew know if the circuit remained intact across the miles of drowning abyss. Within hours of starting the payout, the delicate electrical connection suddenly went completely dead without warning. 40 miles from the splice site, the wire had snapped in deep water, forcing both ships to turn around, meet again in the empty ocean, and perform the intricate splicing operation a second time. Disaster struck again almost immediately when the wire snapped a second time after 80 miles, and then a third time after 140 miles had dropped into the sea. Each failure erased days of exhausting labor, swallowing precious miles of wire into the deep ocean floor and leaving the engineers in complete despair. Naval officers meticulously logged each break, noting that sudden surges in boat motion caused by ocean swells created fatal spikes in cable tension that no break could compensate for in time. The fleet was running out of coal, provisions, and usable telegraph cable, forcing a humiliating return to port in Britain. Back on land, the news of repeated failures triggered widespread fury and hostility among financial backers and the general public alike. Newspapers openly declared the transatlantic cable a hopeless fantasy, and board members urged Field to sell the remaining wire as scrap metal to salvage pennies on the pound. Field found himself nearly isolated, facing intense psychological pressure as former supporters turned away and creditors demanded immediate payment. The board of directors held a tense, acrimonious meeting where a vote was called to abandon the enterprise permanently and dismantle the fleet. Standing before a room of hostile investors, Field made a final, impassioned plea for one last attempt, risking his entire remaining fortune and reputation on a single throw of the dice. With only enough cable left for one final run and zero margin for error, the ships turned back out to sea toward an uncertain fate in the cold Atlantic. In late July 1858, the 2 iron warships met once more at the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to attempt the impossible. Thick banks of fog settled over the icy gray water, hiding the ships from each other as the heavy cable unspooled into the dark sea. Giant sperm whales swam terrifyingly close to the iron line, almost snagging the fragile thread with their massive tails, as HMS Agamemnon pushed east and USS Niagara crept west. Engineers stood over the whirring iron brake drums day and night, watching the ocean tension swallow thousands of fathoms of copper wire. Every wave that lifted the ships threatened to snap the thin cord under its own immense weight, forcing the crew to constantly adjust the mechanical brakes. Through freezing mist and relentless swell, the delicate line held, slowly stitching two separated continents together across 2,000 miles of hidden seafloor. Though the treacherous crossing nearly tore the wire apart in the blinding fog, the two vessels continued their quiet march toward opposite shores. With every passing hour, the deep water swallowed miles of copper core without a single mechanical break. On August 4, 1858, USS Niagara slipped through the dense morning mist into Trinity Bay, Newfoundland, dropping her heavy anchor in quiet coastal waters. Less than 24 hours later, HMS Agamemnon reached the rocky shores of Valentia Island off the western coast of Ireland. The two ends of the great iron thread had finally reached land, bridging the immense ocean basin for the first time in human history. Crews dragged the massive cable ends through the breaking waves and carried them up the cold stone beaches to tiny wooden terminal huts. Inside those small rooms, technicians stripped away the thick outer iron wrapping to reveal the central copper strands, connecting them directly to sensitive electrical instruments. For the very first time, an artificial pathway stood complete between the old world and the new. Now that the copper path spanned the entire Atlantic floor, operators at both ends prepared their electrical meters to test the line. They cleared the shore connections and monitored the tiny magnetic needles, waiting for the first artificial pulse to cross 2,000 miles of silent seabed. On August 16, 1858, the line carried its first official transmission, sending 99 words of greeting from Queen Victoria to President James Buchanan. The message took hours to clear the vast distance, but its arrival triggered massive celebrations across major cities. Bells rang out, fireworks lit the night skies, and crowds gathered in the streets to honor what was called the wonder of the century. Information that previously took 2 painful weeks to travel across the storm-racked ocean by steamship now moved in minutes. Financial markets adjusted stock prices almost instantly. Newspapers printed international news on the day it occurred, and government official dispatches reached foreign ministers across the Atlantic before the sun set. This sudden collapse of time and distance gave millions of people a thrilling sense that the planet had grown intimately smaller. The isolation that had defined human civilization for thousands of years seemed to vanish overnight in a wave of public awe. Yet beneath the wild public celebration, a fatal flaw was silently destroying the iron line from the inside out. The company chief electrician, Wildman Whitehouse, was a man driven by deep ego who stubbornly rejected the findings of leading scientific experts. He believed that the only way to push clear signals across 2,000 miles was to blast the wire with staggering amounts of electric voltage. Whitehouse built massive induction coils that surged 5,000 volts of electricity into the thin copper core. The fragile gutta-percha sap insulation surrounding the wire was never designed to endure such extreme electrical friction. Instead of sharpening the weak signal, these massive high-voltage shocks began to melt, burn, and crack the protective rubber casing buried under miles of crushing ocean water. Deep on the seafloor, high electrical charges burned tiny holes through the softened rubber insulation, exposing bare copper to the cold salt water. Searing sparks tore through the protective sheath, allowing dark ocean currents to leak directly into the heart of the cable. By late August 1858, operators in the shore stations noticed the incoming letters growing painfully faint and distorted. The once crisp electrical pulses melted into a slow, unreadable babble of erratic needle twitches. Operators spent exhausting hours trying to decipher single words, but the transmission speed ground down to an agonizing crawl. As seawater ate into the burnt insulation, electric current bled continuously into the surrounding ocean floor instead of traveling along the wire. Desperate to force the signal through, Whitehouse turned his massive coils even higher, unaware that each violent shock was permanently destroying the last remaining copper pathways deep in the dark water. Operators adjusted their delicate mirror galvanometers to catch the faintest flicker of light, desperately trying to isolate valid letters from background electrical noise. They recorded every scattered pulse in logbooks, but whole sentences dissolved into meaningless fragments. On September 20th, 1858, after just 3 weeks of weakening activity, the transatlantic cable fell completely silent. In the dim testing huts on Valentia Island in Newfoundland, operators frantically tapped their brass keys into the darkness, but no response ever came back. The line was stone dead, buried beneath 2 miles of relentless ocean water. A heavy wave of shock and profound despair washed over the public as news of the total failure spread across the globe. Millions who had celebrated the dawn of instant communication were left facing the crushing reality that the Great Wire was nothing more than 2,000 miles of useless scrap on the dark sea floor. The silence from the abyss brought an abrupt end to the brief age of global connection, replacing wild optimism with bitter suspicion. Questions immediately arose over how a project of such immense promise could collapse into total ruin so quickly. When the electric line fell silent in late 1858, the euphoria that had swept both sides of the Atlantic dissolved into profound suspicion. In city squares where bonfires had burned just weeks earlier, crowds gathered to express a dark and mounting anger. The sudden collapse of communication across the ocean felt less like a technical failure and more like a deliberate, cruel deception staged for a gullible public. Major newspapers began openly branding the entire enterprise an elaborate fraud. Headline writers claimed that no actual messages had ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean, asserting that the exchange between Queen Victoria and President Buchanan was a manufactured stunt designed to inflate stock values. The wire resting at the bottom of the ocean was dismissed as a useless piece of iron wire wrapped in hemp, leaving investors facing total financial ruin. Although critics insisted the ocean wire was nothing more than a profitable illusion, official parliamentary committees were formed in London to examine every inch of manufacturing records and operator logs. Investigators seized daily transmission journals from the remote stations on Valentia Island and Newfoundland to determine if any true electrical signals had ever reached the opposing shore. For Cyrus Field, the public backlash delivered a crushing personal and financial blow. The vast fortune he had amassed as a paper merchant vanished as creditors demanded immediate repayment for defaulted loans. He found himself mocked openly in the streets of New York, ridiculed by former associates as an unhinged dreamer who had lured sensible investors into throwing millions into the deep sea. His commercial reputation shattered, Field retreated into a mountain of debt while trying to preserve his family from complete ruin. Yet even as bankruptcy threatened his household, he refused to burn his remaining maps or abandon the project, maintaining an unshakable belief that the underwater connection could still be made to work. Even as debt collectors stripped away his remaining assets, Field spent his evenings writing hundreds of letters to prospective backers across Europe, refusing to let the project die. He painstakingly cataloged every engineering failure, from the 1858 attempt to build a compelling case for a renewed effort. The true cause of the breakdown was finally uncovered by the brilliant physicist William Thomson, later known as Lord Kelvin. Thomson conducted rigorous lab tests on remaining cable segments, proving that Edward Whitehouse had destroyed the wire by blasting it with high-voltage induction coils. The high voltage had literally melted the gutta percha insulation, allowing seawater to enter and short-circuit the copper core. Thomson demonstrated that long ocean cables required an entirely different operational method. Instead of forcing heavy power through the line, operators needed to send delicate, low-voltage pulses through the copper wire. To detect these microscopic electrical signals, Thomson invented a mirror galvanometer, a delicate instrument that used a tiny beam of reflected light to reveal the weakest electric currents passing through the ocean depths. with Thomson's delicate mirror instruments proving that low voltage could carry messages across thousands of miles of salt water, the fundamental flaw of the original line was forever exposed. This scientific breakthrough laid the groundwork for a far more reliable engineering design. Before any new expedition could be funded, history intervened with tragic violence as the American Civil War broke out in 1861. For 4 bloody years, national focus shifted away from international communication toward battlefield survival. Deep below the stormy Atlantic, the abandoned, broken wire lay silent and forgotten in the cold silt, while hundreds of thousands of lives were lost on land. The silence along the ocean floor served as a somber reminder of human isolation during a time of extreme conflict. Families separated by the Atlantic Ocean were once again forced to wait long weeks for news of lost relatives arriving by steamship, highlighting how fragile international human connections remain when war tears nations apart. By 1865, with the war ended, Field organized a new attempt using the colossal iron steamship SS Great Eastern. 5 times larger than any other vessel afloat, the massive ship was the only craft capable of holding the entire 2,000-mile length of a newly designed, thicker copper cable within its gigantic hull. The expedition progressed smoothly across 1,200 miles of open ocean until tragedy struck just 200 miles from Newfoundland. While paying out wire into 2 miles of ocean water, the heavy line snapped under sudden tension and vanished into the black depths, leaving the crew staring helplessly at the severed end trailing into the sea. Though the sudden loss of the 1865 line devastated the crew, the thick, heavily insulated wire had proven its electrical superiority over every mile laid before the snap. Engineers knew that the basic physics and design of the new cable were fully sound. Undeterred, Field raised fresh capital to launch yet another expedition in 1866. The Great Eastern successfully laid a brand new, perfected cable from Ireland to Newfoundland, establishing the world's first permanent transatlantic telegraph link. But the engineers were not content with just one working line. They turned the giant ship around and sailed back into the open ocean to search for the wire lost the year before. For days the crew dragged massive iron grappling hooks across the pitch-black ocean floor, 2 miles beneath the surface. Miraculously, the iron hooks snagged the lost 1865 cable, hauling the dripping line back onto the deck where engineers spliced it to fresh wire, giving the world 2 fully operational lines across the sea. By bringing the submerged 1865 line back to the surface and testing its electrical copper core, technicians confirmed that gutta percha insulation could preserve delicate wires indefinitely in the cold ocean deep. The permanent connection altered human existence almost instantly, shattering the ancient constraints of time and distance. Fluctuating market prices that once took weeks to travel between London and New York were now verified within seconds, allowing merchants to trade with unprecedented speed. Diplomatic crises that might have escalated into catastrophic global conflicts were diffused through real-time communication, forever uniting distant continents in a shared rhythm of instant news. When the permanent link finally held in July 1866 aboard the Great Eastern, the ancient fabric of human distance collapsed almost overnight. Merchant ships that once waited up to 3 weeks for cotton and wheat prices across the Atlantic were suddenly guided by instant electrical pulses. Military commands from the British War Office were rewritten in minutes, canceling troop deployments to Canada before regiments ever left port, fundamentally altering the execution of state policy. That sudden collapse of physical distance permanently reshaped global power, proving that an invisible signal traveling through 1,800 nautical miles of ocean could dictate the movements of empires. Cabinet ministers in London and diplomats in Washington no longer waited on winter gales to exchange critical terms, establishing a new reality where strategic supremacy belonged to whoever controlled the underwater wire. Down in the silent abyssal plains, more than 2 miles beneath the ocean surface, the physical footprint of that victory remained fixed in complete darkness. Pressures exceeding 300 atmospheres and temperatures hovering near freezing preserved the heavy iron armoring, hemp wrapping, and gutta percha resin casing, locking the long wire into the deep oxygen-poor silt where surface storms could never reach. The ocean floor, once feared as a fathomless abyss separating continents, became a meticulously mapped seabed defined by precise navigational coordinates. Survey ships like HMS Cyclops had sounded the shallow expanse known as the Telegraphic Plateau, dropping lead lines to chart every submarine ridge and mud plain, turning a dark, unknown wilderness into a carefully measured industrial corridor for global infrastructure. For the men who devoted their lives to the effort, the ultimate victory brought a quiet and deeply personal aftermath. American businessman Cyrus Field had spent 12 grueling years on the edge of total financial and emotional ruin, crossing the Atlantic over 30 times, enduring public ridicule and catastrophic cable snaps before seeing his grand vision permanently secured in the summer of 1866. On remote, windswept shores like Valentia Island in Ireland and Heart's Content in Newfoundland, telegraph operators worked around the clock in isolated stone outposts. Straining in total quiet to read tiny flickers of light on William Thomson's mirror galvanometer, their lonely watches bridged two hemispheres, transforming forgotten coastal villages into the vital nerve centers of global communication and intelligence. The immediate aftershocks shattered long-held political and diplomatic assumptions in major power centers like London, Paris, and Washington. By late 1866, international disputes that previously required months of agonizing sea voyages to mediate were diffused in a matter of hours, as foreign ministers exchanged precise cable dispatches directly across 3,000 miles of ocean. Financial markets instantly synchronized across the Atlantic Ocean, destroying the lucrative price delays that arbitrage traders had exploited for generations. The London Stock Exchange and Wall Street became linked parts of a single continuous circuit, where an interest rate decision in Britain or a crop report in America sent immediate price fluctuations through trading floors thousands of miles away. Yet historical records and contemporary engineering assessments leave one fundamental warning regarding the ultimate security of underwater networks. The catastrophic failure of the 1858 cable, ruined in just 26 days by excessive electrical voltage and insulation breakdown, exposed how fragile humanity's reliance on submerged technology truly is when placed at the mercy of harsh oceanic forces. Even with modern acoustic sonar and specialized cable-laying repair vessels, the deep ocean floor remains an unpredictable hazard zone. Submarine earthquakes, massive underwater landslides, shifting continental plates, and heavy commercial fishing trawlers continue to sever buried lines, creating sudden physical disruptions that no surface monitoring system can entirely prevent or immediately repair. Today, the long-term legacy of those 19th century transatlantic trials forms the unseen backbone of the global digital age. Over 99% of all international interbank financial transfers, strategic military communications, and daily internet traffic still travels through submarine fiber optic cables laid along the exact bathymetric pathways charted by British and American hydrographers during the Victorian era. Modern fiber optic lines, encased in high-tensile steel wire, copper power conductors, and waterproof polyethylene, rest on the seabed directly adjacent to the decaying gutta percha and iron remains of the original cables. Humanity remains critically dependent on the exact physical channels opened through industrial determination and scientific trial over a century and a half ago. The immense human cost, financial devastation, and relentless engineering obsession that drove 19th century visionaries like Cyrus Field and physicist William Thomson still echo through every high-speed data line buried beneath the sea. Their willingness to risk vast fortunes and personal health on a deep-sea experiment permanently tied human civilization to underwater physical infrastructure. Deep beneath the cold, high-pressure Atlantic waves, those quiet remnants of iron wire and gutta percha resting in the abyssal mud remain a silent monument to the birth of instant global contact. They serve as a permanent reminder that our complex, hyper-connected modern world still hangs on fragile physical threads stretched across the dark ocean floor,